For Halloween this year, I am fantasy football, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm here to give you our top 40 wide receiver rankings for week 9. No, I don't think Cedric Tillman is a must-start player. Sue me. All right, let's get into this. Tier 1, we don't need to talk about. We can start with Tier 2. Malik Neighbors, obviously, you are jamming him in. You can make an argument he's a Tier 1 player if the Giants were a better offense in general. The projections here with this Giants offense actually are a lot better this week than they were last week. But still, even last week, you got 13 targets from Neighbors. Right now, the man's sitting with 7, 18, 12, 15, 8, and 13 targets so far this season. I mean, I would imagine that he should be the number 1 wide receiver in the NFL in targets per game. Now, of course, just because the offense is going to be worse than the Tier 1 players, it's hard to say that he has the same touchdown upside as those names. Now, going over to our next player, we are going to be looking at Drake London. Now, London was very disappointing this past week, and I completely understand if you wanted to go through and move London to the bottom end of this tier. I just want to make sure we make a statement ranking here. This is somebody that you need to start. Looking at this right now, you're averaging over the past 5-6 weeks about 10 targets per game. This currently projects to be the second highest scoring offense in the NFL this week, only behind the Buffalo Bills. And this should be the highest scoring game in the NFL, where right now you have an implied team total of 27.25 points for the Falcons, and you're looking at an implied total of over 25 points for the Cowboys. This game has an over-under of almost 53 points. So, I mean, I don't know if we've seen sportsbooks have an over-under this high on any game this season. Now, Puka Nacua will be our next name. Puka, insane last week. 57% of the snaps, and the man managed to have over 100 receiving yards in a tough matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, this is a much better matchup going up against the Seattle Seahawks. I think most weeks I would actually be placing Puka Nacua ahead of Drake London. It's just this game environment should have fewer points scored. Still should be a great offense. But I mean, right now, this is a game environment with an over-under about 48.5 points in comparison to what we were talking about with the Dallas Falcons game up at about 53, 54. Now, our next name will be Chris Olave. This is the highest that I think we have ever ranked Olave. But looking at this, you're going up against the Carolina Panthers. You have an implied team total of over 25 points here in New Orleans. This is the best matchup you could possibly have. You have efficient quarterback play, or at least more efficient quarterback play coming in with Derek Carr in comparison to what we had over the past 2 weeks. And this past week, you had 14 targets with no Shaheed and Bub Means dealing with a high ankle sprain. So Chris Olave is an absolute must-start wide receiver. I mean, if you wanted to trade for him, you would have to do it right this second. You're not going to be able to buy him after this week. And then obviously Cooper Kupp will be ranked ahead of Olave most weeks going into the future. Kupp, similar to Puka, played a limited number of snaps his first week back, only played 58% of the snaps for the Rams. But with that being said, he still managed to score 16 fantasy points. And we know that this is going to be a highly concentrated offense going into the future, really only being funneled between Kupp, Puka, and Kyron. It's the most concentrated offense in the NFL. I do think we see some regression where more likely than not, you are not going to get another 2-touchdown game from Demarcus Robinson. Now, going down to our next tier, DK Metcalf will be our next receiver. So how things are slated right now, you're looking at Metcalf not practicing on Wednesday, but the Seahawks remaining optimistic that he will play this next week. Now, of course, the Seahawks kind of should probably view this as a must-win game in division here against the Rams, where over the past few years, Metcalf has performed quite well against this Rams secondary. I mean, this Rams defense has given up a ton of points so far this season. My only hesitation is that you do have a bye week in week 10 for Seattle, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if they want to play it safe with Metcalf. Our next guy will be T. Higgins. If you are looking at Higgins, obviously, we're going to have to monitor the practice reports. From what I have read, it sounds like Higgins with the quad's going to be good to go. But Higgins is going to be very dependent on the availability of him at practice. If this is a situation in which T. Higgins doesn't practice all week, and then we get to Sunday morning, he's a game time decision, and he ends up playing, I would probably move Higgins dramatically down these rankings, because we've seen in the past this Bengals team have Higgins active to go out there and play 2 snaps, to have Higgins active to go out there and play 5 snaps if he's dealing with an injury. So I'd be a little bit hesitant to just jam in Higgins unless we see the practices. But if we do, I mean, this is a great offense. The last 4 games played, you are averaging over 10 targets a game. Now, Garrett Wilson is going to be going up against the Texans tonight. I still view Garrett Wilson as a must-start receiver, even if this is a worse Jets offense than you previously expected, even if you're in a situation in which Davante Adams is taking a considerable amount of targets. Right now, Underdog has Garrett Wilson higher, lower 63.5 receiving yards for tonight's game. You have Davante Adams higher, lower 55.5 receiving yards for tonight's game. So they do have Wilson as the wide receiver 1 here as well. I think we could see the target slide for Conklin. And obviously, if you wanted to go and tail us on Underdog for tonight's game, we're going to be going with a Breece Hall to score a touchdown. You actually get vulture protection with that on Underdog, where if Breece gets vultured by Braylon Allen at the goal line, then you're going to get a refund on your pick'em, but you're getting an additional 1.0x multiplier on that. And if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus. You're going to get a free CJ Stroud pick, more than less than half total yard for tonight's game. And you're going to be getting a free team review in the live stream that we're doing every single night. Just make sure you go through the link in the description or comment section. Now, our next name is going to be Devonta Smith. Looking at Smith, super consistent outside of 1 week against the Giants. The 1 week against the Giants where Philly has 45 rush attempts. Smith has seen 15, 20, 15, 15, 20 points. It's a great matchup going up against Jacksonville. Jacksonville has been a team that people have been able to score at will against, especially opposing wide receivers. Now, of course, if you are looking at Smith, since he has come back from the concussion, it's not like we've seen a crazy amount of targets. You have only had 13 targets over the past 3 weeks, so you could possibly make an argument that you do have some negative touchdown regression. Now, Terry McLaurin will be our next name. With McLaurin, we're assuming that Jaden Daniels is good to go. And since week 3, McLaurin has been phenomenal. This has been by far and away the best season of his entire career, where you're looking at 20 points, 18 points, 13 points, 23 points, 15 points, and 17 points. The game against the Giants, I would actually have expected that Washington was going to be heavily favored in this. But surprisingly, you actually only have Washington favored by about 3.5 points. So that is something to point out. And then Davante Adams is still going to be a must-start guy for us every single week. While, yes, he's been disappointing since he got to the Jets, at the same time, you can say the same thing about Amari Cooper. You can say the same thing about DeAndre Hopkins. I think just realistically, these guys that are changing teams halfway through the season, you probably have to give them a little bit of time to get ramped up. Now, going over to our next tier, we're going to be led off with Tank Dell. Dell has been a train wreck so far this season. I want to be so proud of our Underdog call where we went through and we faded Tank Dell. We drafted as much Stephon Diggs as we could possibly get. And somehow the people drafting Dell are going to luck box themselves into a decent season. If you drafted Dell, I'm sorry, you got lucky here. But now that you have no Nico Collins for tonight, now that you have no Stephon Diggs rest of season, Dell's for sure going to be a viable play. You actually see a season high 75% of the snaps this past week against Indy. Now, of course, he has not had a single game with double-digit targets so far this season, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if that happens tonight. And also, if you are looking at Underdog picks, he is currently higher, lower 58.5 receiving yards, which is a higher mark than what you have with somebody like Davante Adams. Now, Marvin Harrison Jr. will be our next receiver. I want to reiterate with Harrison, we've been very consistent with this, that he's a wide receiver that you probably got to start every single week. I would naturally assume that he continues to get better as the season goes on, as you would assume that most rookie wide receivers would. But as things stand right now is that Marvin Harrison Jr. is playing kind of the field stretching role in this offense, where he has been that deep threat wide receiver. He's been providing a lot of value to the Arizona Cardinals offense, but at the same time, this has made him a little bit more boom bust than what you would like to see. Now, our next option will be Jalen Waddle. For the love of God, Waddle do something here. I was so excited to start Jalen Waddle with Tua this first week, and Waddle gives you nothing. Now, if you're looking at Underdog, he's higher, lower 49.5 receiving yards. So it's hard to call Waddle like a high-end wide receiver too at this point. This game against the Bills, I would have expected the projections to have it as a very high-scoring contest in general. But right now, the Bills are like 7-8 point favorites here. And the Miami Dolphins offense actually projects pretty poorly, according to Vegas Sportsbooks, even with the addition of Tua back in. So it is a little bit frustrating, but with that being said, I don't know what you want to see. I mean, here with Waddle, you still have the big play upside. I'm starting him in the flock league over guys on my bench like Ladd McConkey and Ramondre Stevenson, and I'll probably end up regretting it. Amari Cooper dealing with the wrist injury. This will be something to monitor. Amari played 35% of the snaps against Tennessee, played 50% of the snaps against Seattle. Against Miami here, right now, Buffalo projects to be the highest scoring offense in the NFL. We're going to assume that Amari expands his role under the assumption that he is fully healthy, of course. So we're going to have to monitor the wrist injury with Amari. Jaden Reed will be our next receiver. Obviously, with Reed, we've had him as a sell-high candidate in the past, primarily looking at the boom-bust nature that you have where the target volume is not going to be very consistent. You have one total game with more than 6 targets this season. Now, I'll say that you have to start him every single week, regardless, assuming that Jordan Love's under center, because it is a phenomenal offense when that is the case. But if Malik Willis is starting, you move Jaden Reed dramatically down. Now, of course, I'll be updating the rankings on flockfantasy.com every single day. And at the same time, I'll give you the updated flex rankings later in the week. Now, DJ Moore will be our next player. With DJ Moore, very disappointing this past week. Caleb Williams was absolute garbage against Washington. You did actually have more targets going in the direction of Keenan Allen. You're going to assume that Rome Odunze, as the rookie receiver, continues to improve. Now, with that being said, with DJ Moore here, I still expect that he's the wide receiver 1, and this should be a bounce back spot for Caleb. A much better matchup that you have going up against the Arizona Cardinals. Now, our next player will be Darnell Mooney. Would absolutely love to start Mooney this week in a game environment in which what we are talking about with Drake London is supposed to be the highest scoring game in the NFL this week. You have 2 games with 8 targets. You have a game with 16 that are kind of skewing the numbers here. Most weeks we're going to be expecting about 6 targets for Darnell Mooney. So he's a little bit boom bust in terms of your flex play. But I think this week in a great matchup, you can roll with it. Like, I actually have Josh Downs ranked ahead of Darnell Mooney rest of season. The issue is with Josh Downs for this week in particular, while I understand that Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp had a great game against the Minnesota Vikings, my base level expectation is still that the Vikings are a fantastic defense, one that we should be lowering expectations for our players when they have to go up against them. If you're looking at Downs, however, I mean, this past week with Anthony Richardson having like 170 passing yards, Josh Downs had 109 receiving yards. Josh Downs with Joe Flacco had 22, 15, and 19 fantasy points, averaging about 10 targets a game, exactly 10 targets a game. So Downs is very exciting now that you have Flacco back in. I just don't love the matchup against the Vikings. Ladd McConkey, I will be benching him for now. He is on my bench. I have Jalen Waddle in there in my second flex spot. If you can go to the comment section, if you think that I'm way wrong with this and I need to start Ladd over Waddle, I'm all ears. The thing with Ladd is, while I understand the 29 points was phenomenal this past week, I'm pretty sure if we add up all the points Jalen Waddle's scored all season, he hasn't hit 29. This was off of only 6 targets for Ladd. I mean, you're looking at 7, 4, 6, 7, 8, 7, 6 targets so far this season. Going up against Cleveland, I'm not expecting this to be a super high-scoring game environment. It is encouraging, though, that Herbert is throwing the ball more than he did earlier in the year. Now, our next player will be Zay Flowers. I am assuming that Flowers is still going to be by far and away the wide receiver 1 in Baltimore in the short term. Long term, Deontay may expand his role, and this may be more so wide receiver 1A, wide receiver 1B scenario. Against the Denver Broncos, right now you have a spread in this game of like 10 points. The Baltimore Ravens are actually going to stomp Denver. So it's probably a game environment which they can just run the ball consistently in the second half. And if Deontay has any usage, I think I'd be concerned. We were thrown for a loop when right before the Sunday games, Ian Rappaport said that DeAndre Hopkins was going to be playing a ton. It ended up not happening. Hopkins only played 32% of the snaps against the Raiders. But right now in this matchup, you have the Chiefs projecting out with an implied team total about 27.5 points. They should be one of the highest scoring offenses in the NFL this week, if not the highest scoring. And if you are looking at what you have with Hopkins, I would assume that we get up closer to 60, 70% of the snaps played this week in a really good matchup against Tampa. Calvin Ridley absolutely dominated against the Detroit Lions in a game environment in which obviously it wasn't a real football game. Going up against the New England Patriots here, you can maybe say the same thing is going to happen. You actually have a much better projection for this Tennessee Titans team this week than they were last week. You actually have the Titans favored over New England this week with an implied team total over 20 points. Obviously, I think we can say you'd rather have Levis in here if you are a Ridley owner. Now, Xavier Worthy will be our next guy with Worthy. Back-to-back games with 8 targets, plus great matchup against Tampa, so I like it. Now, going down to our next tier, we're going to be looking at Jacoby Myers as a receiver that should just be flooded with targets over the past month. He is averaging about 8-9 targets a game. Obviously, the drawback with this is while it's a great matchup against Cincinnati, this is still a bad offense regardless. Now, our next player was Cedric Tillman. I know this is who everybody wants to start. He has been phenomenal. I mean, so far looking at what you've had with Jameis Winston, the man is averaging 25 points per game. It's absurd. He's been significantly better than Jerry Jeudy. He's been significantly better than Elijah Moore. This is despite Elijah Moore actually seeing more targets than him this past week. Tillman is the wide receiver 1 here for me in my Browns rankings this week. I'll say I don't love the matchup. Sportsbooks are definitely giving more credit to this Browns offense with Jameis under center than they did with Deshaun Watson. But I would be a little bit concerned of some natural regression where if the touchdowns aren't there, Elijah Moore is seeing as many targets, and a bad matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers. I think you can be a little bit hesitant. Don't need to call him a must-start option. Now, I can already hear you in the comment section screaming, Mason, Cedric Tillman's way better than Jalen Waddle, blah, blah, blah. Cedric Tillman's higher, lower, 44.5 receiving yards on Underdog. So if you love Cedric Tillman, you better be taking the higher than 44.5 receiving yards for him on Underdog. I'll leave you the link in the description if you like it so much. Now, going over to Jackson Smith and Jigba, JSN obviously plays ahead of Tyler Lockett this past week with no DK Metcalf. JSN would be higher in these rankings if Metcalf does miss. I think it's a very safe spot to say that he is the guy over Tyler Lockett for wide receiver 2 here. But still at the same time, I don't necessarily know if you are excited to play him with a healthy DK. Shakir, Keon Coleman will be our next 2 names. Again, this should be the highest scoring offense in the NFL this week going up against Miami. You have an implied team total of about 28.5 points. A spread on this game of about 7-8. I mean, sportsbooks are projecting that the Bills just absolutely stomped the Dolphins. Obviously, the last game that you had against Miami, it's not like Keon or Shakir really did anything, but Keon ended up getting benched for showing up to something late. Shakir, really Josh Allen just didn't have to throw the ball at all because it wasn't competitive. It should be at least a little bit more of a competitive game than last time. While at the same time, I am expecting that Amari probably does play more snaps than he did last week and expand his role. Now, our next name will be Michael Pittman Jr. I definitely think that you can say Pittman's the wide receiver 2 here at this point in comparison to Josh Downs. Like we discussed, when you had Joe Flacco in a quarterback, Downs is averaging 10 targets a game. However, if you actually look at what we've had from Pittman so far this season, Pittman has not had a single game with double-digit targets. Not a single one. You have 1 game with more than 63 receiving yards. Now, again, I definitely think he's more viable with Flacco under center, but it's a tough matchup against Minnesota. Gabe Davis will be pretty much impossible to rank right now. I don't know if Gabe Davis is healthy. I'm assuming that Brian Thomas Jr. is going to miss. He was at practice on Wednesday, though, so it'll be something to monitor. Jordan Addison will be our next player. Looking at Addison, you've had 7 targets over the past 2 weeks. You have 1 game this season with 5 or more targets. So despite him being everywhere on my Underdog teams, despite me really hoping Jordan Addison would be a thing, it looks like he's just sadly not. And then down in our next tier, Romeo Doubs will be going up dramatically if you actually have Jordan Love playing. I mean, Doubs, in my mind, is the clear wide receiver 2 here in Green Bay ahead of the other options. And then we're going to have Keenan Allen, Jalen McMillan, and Leggett. Yeah, McMillan's still my bet, wide receiver 1 here in Tampa. The issue is they're spreading the ball out so much. Looks like nobody's extremely viable. And then looking at Leggett, he's my bet for the wide receiver 1 for the Carolina Panthers. But again, it's about the worst offense in the NFL, so I don't know if you can be excited. But I really appreciate you. Really hope I was able to help you out. Again, if you wanted to take Cedric Tillman to have higher than 44.5 receiving yards this week, you can find that on Underdog Fantasy. If you use promo code FLOCK, you are going to get a free CJ Stroud pick, more than less than half a total yard, plus a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, at the same time, you are going to be getting a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night. Just make sure you use code FLOCK. Go through the link in the comment section and set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address if you're wanting that free team review. But wishing you a great Halloween and hope I get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.